Before I get to the topic of this video, I want to make a few things clear since I can already sense the comments rolling in. I don't think that the label villain is an entirely fitting one for either Aemond or Halbrand, just for very different reasons. But we all know how YouTube titles work, and usually there is some explanation provided in the video itself, which is exactly what I intend to do. And another sort of disclaimer, as with my previous Anatomy of a Character videos, I do not draw parallels to the book versions of analyzed characters. I look at them as they are in each respective show and talk about them based on those depictions. There are many differences between Halbrand/Sauron and Aemond, and I will not be comparing them on the basis of their similarities, but what I do think they have in common is that they are both morally questionable characters from two currently popular TV shows, and I think they can serve as two great examples of good versus bad writing. So let's dive in and examine the things that make one a well-written antagonist, if he can even be labeled that, given that he's so complex that putting a label on him is very difficult, and why the other character just falls pretty flat, as a villain and simply as a character. The showrunners of The Rings of Power had their work cut out as they attempted to adapt J.R.R. Tolkien's beloved, revered legacy into a TV series. Arguably, one of the most ambitious attempts was the depiction of the show's main villain, Sauron, or Halbrand as they chose to name his human form. Thanks to the Rings of Power podcast, we know why the showrunners decided to deviate from Tolkien's lore when it comes to Sauron's depiction.
If you sort of think about the sort of obvious way, it's like, okay, a tall, mysterious, beautiful demigod named Anatar shows up and says, let me help you with all your problems by making you some rings.
Who's going to fall for that?
Yeah, exactly.
It's hard to say what Halbrand is, other than, Sauron. But as a character, I struggled with defining his traits. His depiction in The Rings of Power is a rather inconsistent and confusing one. And the biggest issue that I find with his portrayal is that the show clearly wants him to go from point A to point B, yet everything in the middle, where a logical character development is supposed to be, is missing or is severely underdeveloped. Whenever the show wants to present him as morally ambiguous, it doesn't depict his actions in a way that would support that and be coherent. It often feels more as if the show tries to make the viewer suspicious by putting a big flashing arrow above Halbrand's head.
Does she look dangerous to you?
Looks can be deceiving.
Even Halbrand's first line, "looks can be deceiving," comes across as incredibly on-the-nose clue about who he truly is. But fair enough, since it's the first line and the first scene, perhaps at that point one could assume that it's a misdirect. But this line has no further weight on Galadriel and Halbrand's interaction. If he's referring to himself, that his looks can be deceiving, then why raise Galadriel's suspicions and not lay low? And if he's referring to her, if he's suspicious of her, or even knows right away that she's an elf, well, she never said she wasn't, she just told everyone that she got separated from her ship, which was technically the truth. So he either somehow knows that she will proceed to hide her true identity and wants to make everyone on the raft suspicious of her, which could make sense if he was against her consistently throughout the show. But a few scenes later, he's helping her, saving her, pulling her onto his raft, and even getting closer to her. Halbrand gets the flashy villain sign above his head once again when Galadriel calls him out for abandoning his companions to death after he unties his raft from the others when they are attacked by the sea monster. The issue here is that the audience is not left to observe and come to their own conclusions. We are spoon-fed what the narrative wants us to believe. Again, saying, look, what he did was suspicious. But once again, Galadriel's accusations make little sense since she too escaped by swimming away. They both ran for their lives, and this reaction was quite reasonable in the given moment. So why is only Halbrand getting the blame here? He didn't push anyone into the sea to save his own skin or use them as a human shield. He just did what anyone who had the chance would do in that moment. Removed himself from danger. This doesn't make for a convincing portrayal of a character's alleged negative, dark, or evil traits. But if we move on, Halbrand's scene in Numenor seems very random and reckless, especially for a Dark Lord who is supposed to be a cunning, thousands of years old immortal being. After his interaction with some of the people there, Halbrand gets involved in a brawl because he attempts to steal one of the man's badges. But if his motivation is to blend in and start a new life in Numenor as a blacksmith, as he states in an earlier scene, then how would this help? Everyone will know that he didn't earn his badge, and if the man he beat up is in the same guild, then Halbrand would be making an enemy out of someone who he would be seeing very often if he did stay here. There is no way he could get away with this, especially after a fight, and it was extremely careless, something that you would not expect from a good villain, maybe an impulsive teenager, but certainly not from a being such as Sauron. Galadriel declares Halbrand the long-lost king of the Southlands, despite him telling her on more than one occasion that he found the pendant, that is apparently proof of his lineage, on a dead man. This speaks more of Galadriel's stupidity, but as for Halbrand, if he wanted to gain power over Middle-earth, why not play along? I could understand a bit of humility, but he made it look as if he really doesn't want the position, which tells us two things. Halbrand was either certain that Galadriel would keep insisting until he said yes, and that was a big gamble considering that her believing him to be the king was based on one tiny random pendant, or it tells us that Halbrand really did not want to be king of the Southlands, which is sort of contradicted by him flaunting the pendant and, him being Sauron and all. And if he was planning to stay in Numenor, that's contradicted by his behavior, beating up those men with no consideration for what that might mean if he stayed there and tried to integrate himself into the Numenorian society, whether his intentions afterward were true, or if he eventually did want to convert them to the dark side. And then we come to the grand reveal. Halbrand is Sauron, and he lives because of Galadriel. Well, this one is hard to disagree with because the show's writing is such a mess, and yes, she is very much responsible for bringing him this far. But if we summarize, Sauron in the Rings of Power was once evil, and then after meeting Galadriel, she apparently, for some reason, made him want to be a better person. She told him to leave the past behind, told him that he can be free of it, that he can be a king, but she knew nothing of his true identity at that point, so him believing that she would still feel the same way after he admitted to being Sauron is quite naive on his part, and if he was trying to slowly lure her to the dark side, well, he failed miserably since he can't control his temper and has shown no capacity for scheming. I don't think being rejected by a woman and turning back to the dark side makes for a good character motivation in this case, not only because it unashamedly stumps on Tolkien's lore, but I also think that it doesn't work because Sauron has already done evil things in the past. It's not as if he's choosing evil for the first time and Galadriel's rejection is the straw that breaks the camel's back. Sauron, the Dark Lord, an immortal, power-hungry being, gets so petty and takes things so personally that his motivation for choosing evil again is one elf's refusal to stand by his side. Not to mention what this unfolding of events does to Galadriel's character, but that's a rant for another video. Let's now cleanse our palates by looking at a well-written antagonist instead. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I don't know if I would put the label antagonist on Aemond. We can only have an antagonist if we have a protagonist, and I'm not sure we do in House of the Dragon, which is honestly pretty nice since it goes to show the amount of character complexity in this show. Everyone is sort of grey, morally ambiguous, but I find that motivations of these characters are still very convincing and consistent. Unlike the Rings of Power's Halbrand, Aemond has a very well outlined and internally logical character arc with many payoffs, and a story arc that is believable, and where he is at the end of Season 1 makes a lot of sense. When we first meet Aemond as a boy, he's being bullied by his brother and his nephews, and we the viewers are immediately put into a position where we can commiserate and sympathize with him and his struggles, so we develop a sort of understanding for his position. And an understanding for his development, as well as for future actions where he strives to change how his family and society view him through some reckless, though incredibly brave and admirable actions. While Aemond is still a child in the show, we learn a very important thing about him. He doesn't yet have a dragon, which makes him inferior in the eyes of his brother and nephews, and consequently in his own eyes, which motivates him to consistently strive to prove himself in one way or another. Not to mention that he's also the second-born son, the spare, not the heir, which is probably connected to this as well. But Aemond's desire to prove himself, to himself and to others can be observed on multiple occasions. Firstly, he very bravely decides to claim Vhagar, not just a dragon, but the largest, oldest dragon. He's not just going to prove that he can be a dragon rider, he's going to be a better dragon rider than his siblings and nephews, or at least have a better, cooler dragon. Secondly, he works on practicing and perfecting his skills. Not just any skills, but skills with the blade, a weapon that cost him his eye, and I'll return to this point a bit later on. And thirdly, Aemond demonstrates a big sense of duty, something that his older brother distinctly lacks, and this may be, at least partially, Aemond's way of proving himself in the eyes of his family. He may be the second-born son, but he will be better than his older brother, more devoted to his duties, more deserving of his position as a prince. But of course, we also see that he is resentful, and whether he has the right to be, I will let each of you decide for yourselves. However, it's clear that Aemond's capacity for holding year-long grudges is also in part responsible for why he is being driven to prove and improve himself. Now, this improvement is not moral betterment by any means, but rather Aemond demonstrates that he can learn from mistakes that revealed his weak points, and he works to eliminate those weak spots. Almost like discovering an error in a system and fixing it so that the machine can run smoothly again, and better than before. For example, when he's training in the courtyard, Sir Criston compliments his skills, saying that he will be ready for tournaments soon. Aemond says he doesn't care about competing in tournaments, and I think that makes perfect sense. After all, his reason for training seems to lie elsewhere. The way it comes across to me, he is, in his own way, striving to make up for his failure as a child when he lost an eye to the blade. He's fixing the error by ensuring that something similar will never happen to him again and that he can defeat anyone who may challenge him in this way. Aemond appears to be on a quest for power in order to compensate for the times when he was powerless. And he gains that power not through brute strength, but with his mind, through control, by being in charge of the situation. He is not brash, and he is far from being a slave to his emotions and impulses. His wit is his weapon, and that's how he throws the first punch. But he's never one to start a physical fight, not even as a child. Maybe that last scene can be called a physical attack, and perhaps Aemond allowed his emotions to overpower him in this instance due to the fact that there was no authority around after the boys left Lord Borros's castle. But still, as far as we know, Aemond's attack was intended as intimidation, not meant to cause actual harm to Luke, at least not in the capacity it did in the end. Because controlling situations, being calculating, being on top of things, is where Aemond draws his power from, that last scene is not just tragic for obvious reasons and for what happens to Luke. What makes it even more impactful is the fact that Aemond didn't intend for it to unfold that way. What happened was out of his control, out of everyone's control. And for the first time since childhood, he is faced with powerlessness once again. Aemond's characterization in The House of the Dragon is consistent. It takes into account his childhood and relationship with others, and it builds on those past wounds to shape him into the man he is at the end of Season 1, for better or for worse. His depiction is full of elements intertwined in a logical manner, unlike Halbrand's in The Rings of Power. We can't call Aemond neither a villain, neither an antagonist without further elaboration. He's perhaps best described as a complex, tragic, yet dark character, and one whose story resonates with people whether we agree with his actions or not. The fact that we can hate what he does but still kind of understand his motivations, understand where he's coming from, and see how he got to the point where he is, speaks of quality character depiction. Unlike the depiction of another character who is supposed to be the main villain, but either has very little agency of his own, or is such an incredible mastermind that even the events that happen by pure chance are supposedly somehow orchestrated by him behind the scenes. One thing is for certain though, even from this bad character depiction, we can learn what works and what doesn't, and how to write a character and how not to write one. Thank you for watching. Feel free to check out my other videos on this topic and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you soon.